Okay, first, I guess sort of as a pre-class announcement, I think I've got the system set up. Well, I've got the system set up for the other rooms. The problem with the classroom they gave us now for this class is that it's actually set up for Macs, as I think I might have mentioned before. So everything's sort of a mess. I have no trouble doing Zoom on my Chromebook, but recording Zoom is a trick. I think I've got that figured out. I didn't want to try it today because I want to practice it a couple more times. So because otherwise folks that aren't, that are using Panopto or something to actually see the class later would be flat out of luck, and I don't plan to do the presentation twice. So Tuesday, actually, wait, let's do it this way. Let me know if you want to actually be in the classroom on Tuesday, and if there's one or more folks that do, then we'll do it from the classroom. The intro classes right now, given the option, have decided they'd rather do the Zoom. They don't want to bother, I think, in part coming to school or being in the classroom. So I'll leave that up to you guys to decide. Even if just one person wants to, that's fine. I think I've got the system set up so that I can make it work. Hang on a sec. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's, my personal opinion on this is classrooms sound like a really great idea. But I think what people are actually thinking of is they were thinking of the fall 2019 class where you don't have COVID. I think the idea of being in a classroom in, October 2020 is a lot more iffy in people's minds. And to be honest, it's a lot more convenient for me to do it from the office. If nothing else, I have access to my tea. But also just because the system works, it's robust, and there's no complications involved in it. But yeah, it's not a hassle. I can do it from the classroom. Just let me know. Okay. Second thing is, second thing, actually, I don't think it was you guys. I think it was the class yesterday. Oops, hang on a second down. The class yesterday was asking, when is the Palolo stuff due? I don't remember exactly when. You'd have to look at if you look at your canvassing, it actually has the Palolo project due dates. It's near the end of the semester. But like I was telling the class yesterday, you have to remember, end of the semester is only, what, 5 weeks or something like that? Remember the semester ends on the 25th. So, if you're prone to procrastinating, my suggestion would be, and I'm prone to that, I'd tell yourself that the semester ends in 2 weeks and you'd absolutely scare the crap out of yourself and get stuff done on time. Don't wait on the project stuff till near the end of the semester and think you're going to knock it out. You're all doing actual research, which means you're actually having to dig up stuff, look at stuff, and there's no way of knowing whether the stuff's actually there. Or if you've got material, you've got to figure out how to read of it and make sense of it, collate it, and sort of, figure out what it all is talking about. All this is very time intensive. So it's not something that it's not like when you do a term paper, when you can just sort of sit down in a couple of hours, grab some sources off of Google and sort of whack that sucker out. This stuff doesn't work that way. And I'm going to have a very little sense of humor if someone says near the end of the sentence, oh, I misjudged the time and I can't get it done. Well, guess what? That's 15% of your grade you just tanked. So this isn't one of those things you wait on. Get it done now. You've got less distractions on your time this week and next week than you will have in a couple of weeks. So this is labor intensive and it's time intensive. So do whatever you're set aside to do in the project. If, and many of the groups haven't, if you haven't parsed out what you're actually going to do vis-a-vis your partners and your particular area, then by all means, make sure you get that done. I'm also not going to be very impressed if I see two people giving me the same thing, because the ability to communicate is something you guys are supposed to have already had. And of course, in university, you should be able to communicate since you're only having to do it by email. So not doing so is, to put it bluntly, is pretty pitiful. So don't. Just make sure you get the work started. And the other reason behind that, if you're working on this stuff and you find that it's more complicated than you thought it was, or you don't understand, or you can't make sense of how to do something. For example, if you're doing the neighborhoods, that whole sort of house chart guide that the state form is set up for, then let me know so that I can do a work session with your team, with the folks working on that particular theme, and help you guys to understand it so I can answer those specific questions. There's no point in talking to the whole class about it, because you guys are doing very different things. But if you need help, the intent is not to throw you guys out in the deep end and make you suddenly learn how to, for example, be a geologist. But what you'll find in whatever career you get into is you're going to have to access material from different specialties and make sense of it. But I'll help you through that. But you got to let me know what it is you don't know. So be sure and ask. And then I'll set up a time. Maybe I'll cut 5 or 10 minutes at the end of class and we'll go over something specific for a specific group. But again, the sooner you figure out what's going on and what you don't know, for example, the sooner you can get that sorted out and get it done. Right now, I'm thinking, I don't know, I might be out in the field personally next weekend. I'm not sure. I would like to go out before, if we get a rainy season, I want to get out there before so I can see what it looks like when it's dry, at least along Lie Road. But I don't really want to run folks out there as a field, sort of a day field school, probably till early November, and that's depending on how this whole nonsense with the state sort of sorts itself out in the next couple of weeks. We also haven't got approval from DLNR, so I don't want HP to suddenly show up and try to, give us a hard time if we go plopping around Lie Road and scare the hell out of the residents down there. So anyway, start just stuff on the project. Whatever you've said you were going to do, start trying to do it and see what you can't figure out. And if you can figure it out, then start plotting through it. A lot of this is just, it's work, it's research. That's why they pay people like me money to do research, is because no one else wants to do it. On the other hand, it's a skill set you've got to have. It's a skill set that'll make you money. So it's something you should get used to doing, because it's what the work world consists of pretty much nowadays. Okay, with that, let's go on to the next of our groups. We're looking at a sort of, they're sequential in terms of time, but they're also probably two of the other, if there's 4 groups that are really central to the sort of plantation period experience and also the development of the concept of local, which is the groups we're looking at. Of course, the first would be the Chinese, which we've covered. Second would be the Portuguese and the Japanese, which we'll be looking at now. And the last would be the Filipinos. Now, there's a bunch of other groups that show up in relatively small numbers. Most famously, or popularized every once in a while, is the fact that a fair number of African Americans are recruited by one of the plantations on Maui and end up the largest number of them live in Lahaina Luna back in 1883 or something like that, I think originally from Tennessee. And a fair number of that population end up staying there, and their descendants are still in Lahaina. So it's not unusual to see someone who is part African American living in the upper area of Lahaina, whose family's been there for 140 years now. So that's one of these small groups. Most of these small groups were actually brought over because first of a mindset that the chiefs had, and then later this transfers to the sort of the plantation experience. You have to remember the Diari'i when they're in charge, and this is both prior to European contact and nothing changes, for example, when the Europeans come in 1778 plus, is that they saw themselves as sort of decision makers. So if you want to visualize a modern version of a high chief, Ari'i Moku, for example, he's a guy or she's a guy that sits behind, would in the modern sense would be sitting behind a desk, and they've got a thing that says the buck stops here, and people come up and say, okay, we need a decision made. What do you think of this? And they say yes or no, or okay, do this, or hang them, or give them an award or whatever. They're the folks that make decisions. They did not see themselves in many cases as the folks that had to understand process. They were much more adept at playing sort of what you might call personal politics. They were very good at reading people. They were very good at understanding political relations, social relationships. Of course, they were survivors. So they weren't the type that got caught up in details. And they had people that did that for them. That's the role of the taunga in Hawaiian society. What's oftentimes called priest, which is sort of a misnomer, more accurately just a group of specialists who included priest. Their job was to do the details. And then they would go to the high chief and say, okay, here's the situation, what should we do? The chief wasn't in the business of doing the research to figure out what the situation was. So basically, chiefs saw themselves as decision makers and mediators and negotiators, which is still a role, if you think about it. It's still sort of the role that Matai, for example, follow in Samoa and Tonga. So this is not a Hawaiian unique thing. This is pretty much a Polynesian attitude about the idea of high-ranked chiefdoms. when the Europeans come in, of course, then you basically initially, in some cases like Kamehameha, you abduct the Europeans, you abduct Davis, you kidnap Young, and you kidnap some of the Europeans or abduct the Europeans, and it's, initially at least a sort of gunpoint, make them work for you because they're a new version of the specialist. So you can think of the Europeans that come in, both the traders and the merchants and the seamen that come in, or the sea captains that come in from, basically 1780 to 1810. As being a new version of the Taonga. The chiefs keep them around because they want to know, stuff, but they don't want to actually learn the stuff. They want someone to tell them, okay, here's the situation. Here's what guns can do, for example. Here's how you put them on a boat. And then the next thing they want to know is, okay, how many guns do you want? How many boats do you want? That's where the chief comes in. The chief isn't into figuring out the role of ballistics and, cannon fire on a boat. He hires someone to do that. So the chiefs never become specialists. They remain what you might call decision-making generalists. And so when the Europeans come in, they plug them into the same place. Now, of course, when the missionaries come in the 1820s, they do exactly the same thing. They see them as a new group of specialists, and someone like Kaumano just plugs them into the same place. This had worked very well for the chiefs. It actually worked into the 1830s extremely well for the chiefs. It allowed them to make sort of high-level political and social decisions without worrying about the details. They had people that they could trust, or at least they thought so, that would do that for them. And of course, as we saw when we looked at the whole idea of sort of the Haole, especially the Kama'aina, this is where they blew it to a certain extent because they misjudged the relationship of a large number of the Kama'aina to the ruling elite. They assumed that they would be loyal to the family and to the state. And for many of the Kama'aina, loyalty was something that you did at the individual level and for personal gain. So that's where the Hawaiian chiefs, blew it. Their ability to read people was sort of based on a Hawaiian logic, and it didn't apply to people that had a different value system necessarily. And to a certain extent, they paid the price for that. But when the Kama'aina come in and start to take control, we end up with the missionary boys in the plantation period. In many ways, sort of ironically, and you have to remember again, they're partially chiefs. One side of the family are chiefs. But they also, from the American European background, the people that own plantations don't work on plantations. The people that own plantations, especially just to be like the American South or whatever, would sit on a, on a lanai, on a portico, whatever you want to call it, behind, in a nice rocking chair with a mint julep or whatever the hell they drink, gin and tonic if they're British. And they would sit there and they would do the same thing. They would make general decisions. They would not go out there and ride around in the sun and make sure people were doing their jobs and stuff like that. So in their own way, what happens is this idea of having specialists that are in between the workforce or the mass majority on the population and the decision makers on the top persist. It's just the decision makers initially would be the Ari'i. By the 1850s, 1860s, the decision makers could be said to be the Kama'aina Haole. And so the plantation owners, the folks who live in the really pretty white, porticoed mansions, basically take on the same role of generalized decision makers. And import, or need to import, a secondary label underneath them, which will actually be what you might call the field managers or supervisors. And this is a lot of the smaller groups that come into Hawaii, especially from parts of Europe or the United States, are recruited specifically for those sets of functions as technical specialists. There's a fairly large number, in fact, some fairly powerful families on Maui, for example, are actually part of a movement of the plantations recruiting Scots. I have no idea why, and you have to go look at Scottish-British history, but for some reason in the 19th century, Scottish engineers were seen as some of the best, especially when it came to steam. Since plantations are run off of steam power, what you would do is it was signed, if you sort of really had, wanted a good quality engineer to run your operation and to make sure everything worked right, you'd hire some guy that was Scottish. And so you end up with a fairly small but significant number of Scots that come over here to Hawaii. Now, they're not part of the workforce on the plantation since they're cutting cane, but they're also not marrying into the Kama'aina elites. And for example, early on, their kids would not be going to Oahu College or Seabird or something like that. They'd be going to other schools. In fact, in some cases, they'd be going to public schools. So they're seen as not being the workforce, which by the 1870s, 1880s is going to be Asian in one way, shape, or form, pretty much. They're seen as this intermediate group. You hire the specialist to do stuff for you, but he's not someone you're going to invite to dinner. You sure as hell don't want your daughter to marry his kid, and you don't want him living next to you. So you make it very clear that he's not part of your group, but he is he's upscale from the cut the cane workforce, the blue labor, sort of factory worker. So this is this population. And the problem the plantations have is basically in a very simple way. One is what they were willing to pay these guys was so low that it was very hard for them to find anyone that would do the job that was any good. And secondly was the fact that, again, because by the 1870s, 1880s, when the plantations really pick up steam and become these massive operations, imperialist colonialism is at its height. So if you're, for example, if you're German and you're an engineer, you would be much more likely to work for a German plantation, say in Micronesia or in Melanesia or somewhere else in the world that had German colonies, say Africa, than you would be to come to Hawaii. So it was very hard for the plantations to recruit, one, because they were cheap. They were just, they were just mercenary when it came to what they were paid. But also, secondly, was the fact that they were trying to recruit populations that really didn't see any relationship to the plantations nor to the Hawaiian monarchy. And you have to remember, this is all largely occurring in the period of the monarchy. The movement of your specialist and the definition of the plantation system is completely finished by the time that the takeover occurs in 1899 when we become a territory. The plantations have already been in place by 20 or 30 years. They're these massive money generators. The only thing that changes in all this time is who's cutting the cane. That moves from your Chinese to your Japanese to your Okinawan Korean to your Filipinos. But the actual structure of the plantation is way in place. So there's this constant need for these specialists. And also because these specialists would frequently come here, and just like they do today, if you're some sort of a specialist, if someone gives them a better job offer somewhere else, they're out of here. So this was a sort of transient group. It would be sort of that professional managerial group I talked about when I was talking about Haoles as one of the sectors. They're actually fairly early arrivals if you think about it, because they're basically here by the 1830s, 1840s. In fact, in some ways you could argue they actually predate the missionaries. So there's all sorts of small groups. Some of the plantations, you have to remember, at least 3 of the plantations are actually owned by ethnic Germans. And that's certainly Grove Farm, for example, on Kauai was an example. So some of these places would actually recruit folks from their same place of origin. I'm not sure whether they wanted to give them jobs or if they wanted to be managers. It's not really very clear, and I've never bothered to read into that particular literature very much. But for example, a Grove Farm in central Kauai recruits about 12 or 1,400 Germans over a space of about 6 years, I believe, from central Germany, which was undergoing some sort of crop failure or something. So people were really hungry. So it was sort of almost like a rescue service. But also rather cynically, it meant that you had a workforce in the plantation you could basically cheap out on. 1 or 2 of the plantations, again on Kauai, and I'm not sure why Kauai was into this, I recruited a fair number of Russians. This was a total disaster. They recruited a bunch of folks from Siberia. You can imagine a bunch of folks usually living in a Siberian climate. If you suddenly say they're going to work in Hawaii in the plantations, that group is famous because they won this massive sit-down strike and basically had to be shipped back to Russia. They just take one look at this place and they went, what? And that was it. Groups of Norwegians were brought over in little pools of 50 or 100. Some plantations engaged in this, other plantations never did. Pioneer Mill, for example, recruited a group of Danes, about 80 Danish guys, and that turned out to be a flop. And then they just gave up. They never did it again. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Can I ask a question real fast? Is there a reason that they choose to recruit all these people from such cold climates? Since I mean, like Norway, Denmark. I get Denmark, not really, but Siberia just don't seem like good fits for Hawaii.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. If you think about it, you have to remember that the European stereotypes, because the guys that are running the plantation are Anglo-American. Now, the stereotypes they pick up, though they're from Hawaii, of course, they're basically educated in New England, whether it be at Punahou, that was basically a New England school in Hawaii, and then they're educated in New England. The British American stereotypes in the 19th century was very negative on groups like Italians, even French from the south of France, Spanish, Greeks. In other words, the folks from the southern part of Europe, which would actually be the group that you're right, would make more sense. They might not be familiar with plantations, but the climate's really similar. The folks that ran the plantations saw those groups as all being lazy They didn't work for, well, had these huge, really nasty stereotypes. And this actually in the US mainland, this applied right into the 1950s, 1960s against, for example, Italian Americans. And I would be willing to bet in some areas of the mainland United States in 2020, since it's a pretty weird place nowadays, that there are still stereotypes against, Italians or Greeks. So they were generally seen as not particularly hardworking, and in the plantations are thinking, crap, why am I going to recruit these guys from 12,000 miles away if they're just going to come over here and screw around and, drink ouzos and dance Greek dances or something like that. So their stereotypes of the groups meant that they didn't see them as attractive. But ironically, there's stereotypes of groups like Norwegians, Russians I'm not too sure about, but the Norwegians, the Germans, all of these are hardworking groups from Northern Europe, and if we give them a decent chance, they'll be really successful. And of course, from a racial standpoint, there was also attitude of what you're doing is you're bringing more white folks in Hawaii to balance out the fact that the majority population originally is Hawaiian, and then later the majority population is Asian. And in the 19th century, they didn't see Greeks and Italians and Spanish as white folks. And again, I would think if you look at the discussion about Latinos populations in the United States today, I would think a fair amount of, Anglo-Americans would actually not see folks from Mexico as being white folks. So I don't know if that's particularly changed, to be honest. I think it's a little more people politically correctly couch it, but there's still a tremendous amount of segregation against folks that originally came from different parts of Europe. Well, Mexicans, technically, most of those are actually from Indian. They're actually Indian populations from Mexico, but nonetheless. So I mean, you're right. It doesn't make any sense from a practical standpoint. It would make a hell of a lot more sense to bring in people that are acclimated, and so those shock levels lower. And that's undoubtedly why the Russians went on strike. You can imagine. I think it probably gets to maybe 80 degrees in the summer for 2 days. I'm just making this up for in Siberia. They're used to freezing cold weather for like 4 or 5 months of the year. You can imagine what a group like that does if they're suddenly stuck in Kalowatown. What a disaster. It was just their weird stereotypes that the only good Europeans were Northern Europeans. There's still a fair amount of this in Europe. It's really weird. You can see this a lot with the current discussions in the EU about the Northern European countries having to bail out the Southern European countries in the EU. This was reflecting attitudes at the time that were still prevalent all through the 20th century. I mean, when you think about it, if people were being rationally pragmatic, then stereotypes are a real bad reason to basically grab a group. And this is a classic example. There's a couple of articles in Thrum about these groups. I think he's got one called The Vanished. I think it's in volume 4, The Vanished Ethnic Groups, or something like Vanished Groups to Hawaii, where he actually talks about this. And you have to remember, I think he wrote that in 1890. So he's writing that one of these groups are actually showing up still. So sort of segue from Noah's question then, what you did get is somewhere along the line, by the 1860s, 1870s, the plantations have started to massively expand. There's a realization there's a huge demand for Hawaiian sugar. Their main problem is they can grow the sugar, but getting the bodies to actually cut the sugar, i.e. the Chinese initially. But most importantly, you need these people to manage the guys cutting the sugar. And the guys running the operation aren't going to do it. They're above and beyond that. They're CEOs or whatever you want to think of it. So in that context, they look for a group that can be the interface between the grunt workforce on the bottom and these guys bouncing around off the top. And they go and they look at European history at the time. Well, it'd be European current affairs, not history. And what they see is there's a current issue going on in the 1870s. Let's segue over to this. Okay, it's the 1870s. I can't remember, 1874, 1875. And Portugal, which sort of sometimes wins an award for being one of the worst managed European countries. They have a real bad problem with pretty screwed up governments, just like Italy does. So what you get is governments that come into power, they don't know what they're doing, or they who knows? I mean, it just doesn't work right. They mismanaged everything so badly by the 1870s. The country was entirely bankrupt. And a lot of their offshore colonies, or colonies outside of Portugal proper, were actually in real trouble. And what happens is their colonies in the Atlantic actually there's a climatic change that occurs for a couple of years and massive drought occurs. And their colonies in the Atlantic actually end up in the situation where we've got people starving to death and there's rumors on the smaller islands of cannibalism. And this is the 1870s. So we're talking about, mid-late Victorian England or Victorian Europe. We're not talking like, 1300 or something like that. So just very quickly, since Americans usually have very little grasp of geography. Hang on a second, we got a question here. Oh yeah. You have to remember they had their African colonies right into the 1970s, just like they had Macau until what, 1996? I can't remember when Macau switches back to China. Yeah. I mean, Portugal, it's sort of hard to remember. Portugal on one hand, if you look at it, here's Portugal here. So, it's a tiny piece of Europe, and it's basically a chunk off the left end of Spain. But in the 14, 15, 1600s, they become one of the first European groups to actually figure out how to sail effectively. And so they become, of course, one of the first great set of explorers, Vasco da Gama, et cetera, et cetera. And what they do is they parlay their skill at sailing, relatively speaking, into basically by the time by the mid 1600s, they control everything that my hand or my marker is going across over here. They set up about 14 colonies in Africa, including the south part of Africa. They set up a number of colonies in India. Goa was actually part of Portugal till I believe the separation in 1949 or something, maybe even later. They set up colonies in Asia, again, Macau in China. So they were the big players. They were as big or as more powerful in some ways than the Spanish Empire was. The only difference is they didn't find, quote, the Americas per se. So the Spanish won the lottery, if you want to think of it that way, by acquiring the vast resources and populations of the Americas. The Portuguese actually had the first dibs on the stuff coming out of Asia, especially the spice trade. So the Portuguese Empire for a period in the 1500s was probably one of the 3 or 4 most powerful on the planet. But it was all run by this very little piece of real estate here. Now, one of the first places they'd acquired way back earlier, in fact, one of the ones that gave them practice for figuring out how to get anywhere else, were 2 places. One is here, Madeira, the Madeira Island group. And the second was actually one of the most strategically important groups, and that's the Azores here. So these became 2 of the first Portuguese colonies. And if you look at the Azores, you have to realize that that's not anywhere near Portugal. It's not close, but it's significantly closer to North America than Portugal is. So these places are not part of Portugal proper. They were considered colonies. By the 1870s, when Portugal's really screwing up, these are the places that basically ended up in horrible drought. And at least in the Azores, there were rumors from Catholic priests and stuff on the outer islands, since it's a big island group, or I should say a scattered island group, that there was cannibalism going on, that people were literally starving to death and eating, in some cases, relatives just to survive. And so, in Europe, there was this huge horror, and sort of like refugee situations in Syria or Somalia or something like that. You got this international movement in the 1870s to provide money and food and stuff to be sent to the starving populations in the Azores and Madeira. So your folks in the plantations would have been seeing this in their newspapers, that this was going on. And what they decided is they sort of got, 2 and 2 and got 5 out of it, is they decided, we need this middle group of people. Here's a bunch of people that are near starvation, which must mean then no one, people are getting them food, but no one's giving them like a job. So why don't we go and recruit from here to make up this middle level tier population that we need on the plantations? And their logic was, one, these folks are European since they're Portuguese. So that means that they won't have anything in common with the work group, which is good because they're going to agree with the groups yelling at them, using whips on them, or putting them in constant, in solitary confinement to make sure that they work hard on the fields. So they don't want a group that's going to be buddies with a group that's on the bottom. They want a group that's basically going to be sort of like prison guards. And they decide, these folks would be perfect. And they should be willing to take a job because, what the hell else they got? They're going to die out there. So it was a pretty cynical spin that allowed them to feel like they're doing the good thing. But it also just sort of convenient. It was very handy for the plantations. Now, what that meant is, unlike the other groups that recruited the plantations, when they recruit the Portuguese, they recruit them as families. They don't want these guys leaving. They want these guys staying. They want them to basically set up shop and become the middle management for the plantations. So once they've trained them, they don't have to be constantly retraining them. They don't care if they retrain guys with a machete cutting cane. That's a low-tech job, and basically anyone can do it. The guys that are managing them, that's a little more complicated. You want to make sure they stay. So this becomes their thought process. Now, per usual with the plantations, they seem to have been pretty good at making sort of screwed up sort of half decisions based on limited evidence. It apparently never bothered them to actually ask anyone what the folks were like here. And especially the Madeiras, but also the Azores, were under control from North Africa for about 500 years. The Romans had some sort of a colony or were messing around the Azores and the Madeiras somehow. The Greeks actually had apparently colonies in both these areas, at least a little bit. There have been people going through this place. This looks like, you know, like an international airport. So when it becomes under control of the Portuguese in the 1500s, there's almost no one who's Portuguese here. Eventually, most folks learn how to speak Portuguese. They speak their own sort of patois, especially in the Azores, which doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard. But the majority population here is not European. They don't look at all Hawai'i in the classic sort of European sense. They look like a group of folks you'd see in like Tangiers or something like that. There are folks that are European because Portuguese do settle in there from the 1500s on. But it's an incredibly cosmopolitan population, much more than you would find, ironically, in Portugal. But to the plantations here, they see the word Portugal, Portuguese colonies, and think, oh, okay, that means they're Portuguese. And they figure, well, the Portuguese must be like Spanish, so therefore they're Hawai'i, and therefore we should be able to communicate with them because we should be able to speak Spanish. And if you know anything about Portuguese and Spanish, those languages are really, really different. So the plantations made a whole mess of goofy choices. And they thought they were being so clever. I'm sure they almost dislocated their shoulder, patting themselves in the back about how clever they were. And so they went and recruited the populations here. Not surprisingly, a fair number of people jumped on it. They were desperate. They were getting food, but the Portuguese government was consistently even more screwed up every year. So things didn't look like they were going to change. So from 1877 to 1881, 1882, the Portuguese come over here in large numbers, about 12,000, from these two groups of islands, not from Portugal, not from the country of Portugal, from these two colonies to Hawaii. Almost all the plantations got involved in this. They all thought it was an incredibly good idea. But of course, then what crops in is the same problem we've seen before, if you remember, with the infamous plantation store. And that's that they decide, on one hand, they're doing the morally right thing, so now they're going to try to screw Portuguese into the ground again. So you get these populations, you get some poor family that's coming over here from, I can never remember the name of some of these islands. Teresa was one of the big ones here. So you get some family that's coming over from here, and the conditions are pretty hammered out there. On one hand, they're not adverse to working in Hawaii because the climatic conditions in the Azores are slightly cooler. But going back to what Noah asked before, the conditions are actually very similar. The islands are largely volcanic. One of the main crops they grow is sugar. So the Portuguese coming over here actually were probably under less illusions than other groups. They actually had a pretty good idea what these guys were talking about when they said, we want you to grow sugar commercially. And they were saying, we want you to be the guys that do the field management. Whereas in the Azores, they were the guys cutting the cane. So they were going like, yeah, okay, this works. We can do this. And the plantations, of course, heard this. Caucasian running away for work. Let's see. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Yeah, I mean, you mean for plantation labor in the 19th century? Oh, for sure.
I just meant like, did the majority of white people from Hawaii come to Hawaii for work? Like, were they brought over here to be laborers, or were they people that came over to have land and that kind of stuff?
You have to remember, very rarely did your Haole population from the mainland come over here as field labor. And by the late 19th century, when racism becomes a bigger thing, they would not have wanted to, for the simple reason that they would have been working with folks who weren't white. And by then, miscegenation logic is very strong, and they actually would have seen that as being contagious. It might somehow rub off on them. So no, they didn't come over here for plantation field labor. For jobs, oh yeah. But you have to remember that the Haole population in Hawaii was quite a small percentage of the total population. I believe right into the 1930s, it runs between 7 and 12% of the population. So the Haole population here doesn't get large. until basically World War II. And of course, that's temporary. That's all your military coming over here. And it doesn't really expand after that till the 1950s. I don't know what point statistically Haoles actually outnumber, for example, Hawaiian Park Hawaiians, but I would guess it's probably not till the late 1950s if you discount the military dependent part, which is a huge chunk of the population from 1910 on. I believe 1 out of 4 Haoles living in Hawaii in the 1920s, because of the huge military presence we already had. Fort DeRussy, which is now KCC, or Fort Ruger, which is now KCC, all the huge military encampments in places. Schofield was already in place, Pearl Harbor, etc. I think here in Oahu was like 1 out of 4 folks who were defined as Haole were in the military or military dependents, which was way out of whack with the mainland. So we didn't have a large non-military Anglo-Haole component to the population here until probably the mid half of the 20th century. So yeah, prior to that, they were a very small group, which is one reason why they, like you were asking earlier, that's why they were motivated to bring in Germans and other groups, is they wanted to bulk up those really small numbers. Because otherwise they saw themselves as being so very similar to what you'd find in Louisiana or places like that, with a small white elite and then a large number of folks who weren't. And they didn't want that because there was already a huge amount of labor distrust in the U.S. mainland, in those situations. They didn't want that imbalance, but they couldn't figure out how to fix it. And in a goofy way, they sort of thought that these guys were going to be the fix. So they brought these folks over thinking they were bringing a group of Haoles over. And it must have been a huge amount of shock when they saw these folks getting off the boat and they were this totally, cosmopolitan, very 21st century looking population that went all the way from, classic European Haole. Because you have to remember, among other things, you get, Normans from Denmark settling in Portugal. So you got that group plus a whole group of some of your population in the Azores is very, very dark because they're actually descended from the Berbers from North Africa that settled in here prior to the Portuguese. So, the population in the Azores Madeira is just completely across the sort of the color chart. They all look fairly European in terms of physical features, but in terms of skin color, they're completely off the, just the complete spectrum just about. And that must have freaked the hell out of the plantations when they realized they should have probably done a little more research if actually the color of folks was what worried them. The fact they couldn't communicate with the Portuguese apparently also came as a great shock, which you got to sort of wonder why. Wouldn't be that hard to figure out what does Portuguese sound like. So yeah, the whole thing was sort of a classic example of bad decision making on their part. Now, as I mentioned, what they were also very concerned about is what they really wanted to do is they wanted to minimize their cost. So what they do is they charter ships to bring the Portuguese to Hawaii. Or I should say the folks in the Azores and Madeiras to Hawaii. And what they do is they don't pay the charter captains very much. So for example, either the first or second or third ship that comes here from the Azores actually didn't load enough water and food for the population on the boat. And they actually had people dying of thirst and starvation in the transit from the Azores to Hawaii. This caused a huge amount of noise in Europe because for some reason, and again, you have to go back to European history, Portugal and England have always been really close to each other for the last 400 or 500 years. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Portuguese and the British fought on the same side against Napoleon, for example, even in Spain. So the Portuguese and the British are very close. And by the 1870s, when this is all happening, the British control, I just saw this last night, the British control a quarter of the world's surface is under the British flag. And a quarter of the world's population is under British rule. So the British Empire was the 800-pound gorilla on planet Earth in the 19th century. And so what happens is when this huge mess occurs and the plantations are actually killing people they're trying to bring in theoretically to save them, the Portuguese press gets hold of this, they go complain to the British, and the British government takes one look at the Hawaiian government and goes, come here, I want to talk with you guys. What the hell are these people doing? And this would have been Kalakaua, and Kalakaua's going, I don't know. They were supposed to be bringing these people over. So the Hawaiian government dumps in the plantations and tell them, hey, you guys got to get your shit together. This is ridiculous. You're supposed to be saving these people and you're killing them. And so the plantations had to sort of clean up their act, and they were put on notice by the Hawaiian government and the British government that unless they got their act together vis-a-vis the Portuguese, that some very important people like Queen Victoria were going to be very unhappy with them. And you didn't want the 800-pound gorilla unhappy with you. So the Hawaiian government, not by choice, found itself getting involved in this a lot more than they wanted to. They just saw this as a private sector deal between the plantations and a potential labor group, but they got drawn in. Now the plantations, of course, had already messed this up even further. So you have to visualize. You get these folks sailing on a boat. So they're packing on a boat here. We'll say that's one of the slightly better ones. So they're not starving to death, but they're basically suffering in incredibly crowded conditions, sailing in bad weather all the way down around South America, because there's no Panama Canal for another 30 years. And they're sailing around here, and they're sailing all the way over till they get to us. It took, I can't remember how many months, it took a hell of a long time for them to get here. So we'll say that they land at Pioneer Mill. Actually, not, yeah, Pioneer Mill is not a bad example. So they land here, and they land in West Maui. Or actually what happens is they all land in Honolulu, at what's now Sand Island. And basically they're all quarantined there for a day or two where everyone figures out where they're going to go. And they're given name tags, or actually what they're given is number tags, because no one could speak their language and they couldn't speak Hawaiian, nor could they speak English. So basically they're given number like dog tags. These everyone had when they got here. So the Portuguese and the Chinese are the first ones to get these. So, numbers 82 to 123 are then packed on an inter-island boat, and they sail over to Maui, which is where they're going to live, is they're going to work for the plantation here. And at that point, they finally see the conditions they're going to work in. Now, I heard this from friends and stuff up in Maui, whose family originally came over, especially some of the Souses who came over in 1878 to work for the plantations up here in central Maui. Alexander and Baldwin, which is now Maui Land and Pine. And that's a classic story. If you've got relatives or friends who actually are descendants from that population, ask the old members who probably still remember this, because most families still hold this as their family history, what happened. And let's go here, because I can probably give you a good example. I can actually zoom in here. So the plantation goes and says, okay, this was actually part of a plantation. So the plantation goes, okay, congratulations, you guys, you're now going to work for us. What they had promised the Portuguese in the Azores and Madeira is not only would they get a decent paying job, they would also be given a house and an acre of land when they started work for the plantations. And at the time, at the end of 3 years, they would be given the house and the title to the house, and they would be given the title to the acre of land. So to the folks in the Azores and Madeira who are just, incredibly poor, this sounded like a fantastic situation. Someone's paying to ship the entire family to Hawaii. And they had, of course, no idea where that was. And give them land and a house. And of course, now the guys doing the recruiting in the Azores and Madeira could just bullshit it, because this is pre-internet. So they can pretty much tell them whatever they want to. So it's like, oh yeah, it'll be a nice house, windows, a nice lanai in the front, maybe a jacuzzi in the back. I have no idea what the hell they were telling them. But it was these enormously goofy stories. And the acre of land, oh yeah, Hawaii's so beautiful. You have a nice view down, down the slopes of Halakala, and you'll be able to see the sunset, and it's nice and cool up there, and blah, 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 blah. And so they're given all these stories, and for whatever set of reasons, I guess because they had lack of knowledge about it, they bought into it. They sort of said, wow, hey, that sounds pretty good. And so when they get here is, not surprisingly, one of the first things they ask, especially the spouses and the kids, is, where's the house and where's the land? And what they find out is that plantations had decided somewhere along the line, and they do this intentionally. And the plantation owners as a group, in many cases had the moral fiber of a turnip. They go and they actually just lied through their teeth to these folks. So what they do is they suddenly land. So we're now in Maui, and everyone gets out of the carriages, and they're looking around, and the family's all anxious, and the kids are all holding hands and looking at mom and dad, and they're going like, and they ask the guy, and what little English they've got, or maybe they picked up a word or two of Hawaiian, house, land, where's our house? What so we can move our stuff into the house and get ready to start work. And what they get is this. The guy says, and we'll say that they're right here staying on this little road. And he goes, yeah, well, see, this is all plantation land. So you see this gulch over here with these rocks? Your house can be there. We'll give you this acre of land because we can't use it for anything, because it's basically a gulch. So it's like, like this steep. So visualize off of Kiefer. So the acre of land they give them is the slope down from Kiefer down to Pololo Valley. And when they go, where's the house? They go, well, see these trees? We'll sell you a saw. We'll sell you some nails and a hammer, and you can make your house. Isn't that neat? And these guys are going like, what the F? I mean, it's like, how is that a house? And how does this qualify as land? All the Portuguese families can tell you this story. Okay, all the Portuguese families still remember this story. And some of them, like the Sousas, can actually go take you to the part of Kula and stand you on the slope, and they can say, see. And then in some cases, they actually still own the property. They just kept it because they were so pissed off. They kept it in the family as like a memento. And you know, a lot of these places, you literally, if you stood and you rolled a boulder down, it could go for the entire property before it stops. So they didn't get land like this because the plantations could make money off of the land. What the plantations did is gave them garbage land they couldn't use, which was invariably sloped land that was so crappy that no one had a use for it. And their idea of a house was they would give them access to the trees to make a house. But of course, to make a little extra money, they'd sell them the stuff you needed to make a house. So it'd be like, you know, okay, here we're going to give you an acre back in Plolo on the slope here. But you know, if you want anything, you're going to have to work for Chaminade, and basically Chaminade, your first month's salary will go towards a saw and some hammer and nails so that you can make your house. And the Portuguese just went nuts. They were like, you know, what the hell is this, you know, BS? Now, what this did is it meant right from the get-go, the plantations, rather than having a loyal intermediate workforce, because you have to remember, these aren't the guys cutting cane. These are the guys that the plantations expect to trust to make sure that guys work hard in the fields, to make sure that stuff gets done on a schedule, all that stuff. These are your middle-level managers, your supervisors, called lunas here, which you just completely reamed over so that you can make a few lousy dollars. And what that did is that just right from the get-go, it meant that the Portuguese were never going to trust the plantation owners. They didn't like the people they were managing, the Chinese, Japanese, and other groups necessarily. But they figured they had more in common with them, since they were all being reamed over by the owners, than they did with the elites that were running this place. The Kamaina had people skills that you could put in a head of a pin. And all the families, for example, in this part of Maui, my section of Maui, can all tell you. You just go from one gulch to the next. And I think the Sousa's Gulch was this one here. Yeah. This is Sousa's Gulch. Imagine being told you come 12,000 miles from the Azores, and this is what your family gets. Now, on one hand, I suppose, yeah, you do have a view as long as you can build a pole house. But this doesn't really show up here. But this is probably a 100-foot drop from here down to the bottom. And when it rains, of course, this becomes, you know, a giant boulder fest. And this is your land. You've been getting an acre of land here. You can't even grow rocks in that property. And the Portuguese were just, you know, they just, like everyone else, they just wanted to have nothing to do with the plantations. And large numbers of the Portuguese get the hell out, just like the Chinese. The Chinese and the Portuguese were probably rocking out the front gate of the plantation the same morning. Different reasons. Chinese couldn't send money back home because the plantations had reamed them over. The Portuguese were living here with their families, but they couldn't make a living. And what the hell use was this piece of property? Who cares if you've got an acre of this? Even today, you'd have a hard time selling an acre of this. And so they're sort of like, you know, this is bullshit. You know, we're out of here. So the Portuguese from the Azores Madeiras ended up having more in common with the folks who they were supposed to be supervising than they did with the folks who owned the plantations. And this never changed. The plantation owners apparently were somewhat distraught, or I don't know what word you want to use for it, in the realization that the Portuguese weren't really what they considered real Europeans. So at that point, they just really didn't care what they were up to. So the Portuguese very quickly, they're only here for, most of the Portuguese show up in actually about a 4-year period. There were little dribbles and drabs. By 1882 or 1883, I can't remember exactly when, the complaints from the Portuguese here who were sending letters back to Portugal. And there was a Portugal council, like an ambassador here. And the complaints that they got, you probably could fill a bucket with. And the Portuguese council complains, since they don't have a lot of power, they complain to their British counterparts. And the British government goes to the monarchy and says, you know, what the hell are you people doing? First, these guys try to kill them because they're being too cheap bringing them to Hawaii. Then they basically lie and cheat and steal from them the minute they get to Hawaii. It's like, how the hell is this business practice with fellow Europeans? And the plantations don't have an answer because they're too busy trying to screw one into the ground. And the Hawaiian government ends up having to apologize for the plantation behavior, even though the government had nothing to do with it. It was a private sector business. So the Hawaiian government starts to tell the plantations, If you recruit these folks after about 1883, you're going to deal with the British government. And the plantations decide that's probably a really bad idea. By 1884, the Portuguese government shuts down immigration to Hawaii because of the abuses by the plantations and the lies that were generated by the plantation recruiters. So basically, just like with the Chinese, the home government decides that the plantations are such nasty, business types that they tell them, no, you can't have access because you're ripping off our population. So the same thing happens with the Portuguese, which ironically is your family group, European, it's sort of mind blowing, but that's the Portuguese. They never are accepted as part of the Hawai'i elite because of the way they're treated by the plantations, the Hawai'i. They end up becoming locals. So you have to remember, technically, your first group of locals is Chinese and Portuguese. They arrive here in exactly the same year, 1878, prior to the other groups. And even though they're from different places and in different situations, Portuguese are families, Chinese are largely individual men. But the ironic thing is the plantations managed to piss off the two groups that they need to work on the plantations simultaneously, which probably has to be some record for bad management. So what happens is the Portuguese, as they move off the plantations, are much more willing to trust the Chinese, who between the two of them and the Hawaiians, who are sort of interfacing with all of this, are the ones that actually developed the original versions of the Creole that's spoken here on the plantations, which is called Pidgin. So the original form you would have heard in, say, 1882 or 1883 would have been largely Hawaiian with some English, but also would have had large amounts of Cantonese and Portuguese in it. And depending on where you go, if you still go to the ranches on Maui, for example, you still hear a lot of Portuguese. Most of the Paniolos on Ulapalakua and Haleakala Ranch, for example, are Portuguese, Chinese, Hawaiian. Because among other things, these Portuguese then intermarry with the Chinese. They're not going to marry with the Kama'aina because they're not allowed to. They're not even allowed to sit at the same table with them. And they're going to intermarry with the Hawaiians to a certain extent, but the Chinese are more in age and work experience and stuff, have more in common with the Maka'aina in some ways than the Portuguese do, because the Portuguese are coming over as families. So they're going to marry basically a generation later. But by 1900, what you find is a very common form of early sort of Hapa local is Hawaiian, Portuguese, Chinese, and there's still tons of Hawaiian, Portuguese, Chinese families on most of the islands. The Portuguese here on Oahu originally work on the plantations, leave there very early, and the vast majority of them move on the front slopes of Punch Bowl, which is Upper Makiki, which still has a lot of Portuguese families living up there. So the Portuguese see themselves very quickly as part of the working population here, not the management group. And the management group basically agrees. But in common with the other groups is they get off the plantations as fast as their feet can take them. They took a little longer to get off because they had to worry about a family. If you're going to leave the plantation, how are you going to feed a family? So it takes a few more years for them to do so, but as quick as they can, they're out. Now what this means, ironically, is that by the early 20th century, we're now a territory. The plantations go back and in a weird way, in sort of dysfunctional way, started to go back and remember, quote, the good old days when the Portuguese had been the management group, the middle management group, forgetting, of course, how they basically chased them away. And they go, yeah, we need to have this group because now you've got the Japanese who are already going on strike occasionally, and your major labor group here in the plantations, and the Filipinos are starting to come in, and at least starting to come in. So your labor group's now a different group, but it's still seen as Asian, and your Kama'aina elite still see themselves the managers, so they're still missing this interface group, which they, of course, have chased away. So what they do is they basically go, hey, wait, how are things going in Portugal? And sure enough, Portugal being Portugal, they had managed to screw things up yet again. And so what happens is Portugal goes in its second round of bankruptcy right around 1900. And again, I have my remembrance of European politics is really minor. But in this case, what happened is a lot of the trouble was actually in Portugal proper. So whereas before would have been the offshore island groups, or well, it's too far to be offshore, it's just out in the Atlantic island groups, which was the Azores and Madeira. In this situation, the main trouble was political and social unrest, but also, again, large amounts of entire economy collapses in Portugal proper, especially in the area around Lisbon or Lisboa, the capital. So this area, especially from Santarém down to the south. So this whole area is basically just like a disaster zone. And what you get is the same situation. European countries are sending money and food in. This ends up as big sort of, news reports about the disaster in Portugal. And the plantations apparently add 2 and 2 and get 6. That's sort of like, wow, the Portuguese are having trouble again. Hey, wait a second. Why don't we do what we did back in 1878 and recruit a bunch of these people to work on the plantations middle management? Now, going back to what Noah sort of started earlier with, there's a huge difference if you think about it from someone who grows up in Madeira, which is a volcanic island group, and they grow up growing sugar and plantations, and they're selling it, to the Europeans. A lot of it they're selling ironically in Portugal. What happened to my chat? My chat just disappeared. What the hell? Oh, I lost chat. Oh, okay. So what happens is the plantations apparently with their lack of geographic training, which is funny because they're university grads, is they sort of assume that the folks living in here are going to be the same as the folks living in here. Now Lisbon's one of the oldest European cities. It's been around for a couple of thousand years. It was a Roman colony or something. I don't know. It's been around forever. And so what you're talking about is someone who grows up, we'll say hypothetically, in a neighborhood like this. Now this is a rural neighborhood. We're on the outskirts of Lisbon. But a lot of these folks are going to be from here. They're going to be in this sort of suburb. Now, like their counterparts in 1878, they're given this offer for a job. And again, the plantations do the same nonsense. They sit there and give them all this spiel. Again, it's an acre of land. You're going to have a house. We've learned from our mistakes, and so, we're going to make sure we don't screw you over. And they didn't kill anyone shipping them to Hawaii, so I suppose they had learned sort of. So they go and recruit a bunch of people from, say, this neighborhood here. Now, what's going to happen when these guys get they're fresh off the boat and they're standing on Maui, looking at the plantation? What's going to be the problem these folks have? I'll give you a hint. If you look at these houses, what's going to be the problem these guys are going to have if you're going to basically say, okay, you're going to ride around on horseback for 6 days a week and you're going to be supervising a bunch of people and here's your whip, and you're going to be out there, managing a bunch of people while they grow sugar. What's the problem you're going to have with these guys as your field force supervisors? Knowing nothing else about them. Let's say this family here. You're going to move this family out of this house. You're going to ship them to Hawaii. You're going to tell the dad, okay, you're going to work in the fields on the plantation. How much experience does this have guys having working in subtropical climates growing sugar? He's an urbanite. He's used to going out in the afternoons, maybe walking downtown, going out for a glass of wine or something like that. On one hand, he's poor, but he's part of a sophisticated European population. He's not the same as folks from Madeira and Azores who are colonies. He's from one of the largest cities in Portugal. He's got a fair amount of attitude about being Portuguese. He's probably proud of it. And he sees himself as a pretty sophisticated guy in some way, shape, or form, even though he's a farmer. So what happens is when this group comes over, they take one look at the plantations, and the plantations do the same stunt again. They do the same thing with the gulches and the trees, and we'll sell you a saw. And this population just goes, how stupid do you think we are? And a large proportion of this group just goes on strike, and they never actually work a day on the plantations. This is the second move. That's this group, the 1906 to 1910, 1911 group. They actually recruited more in total numbers. The second group, the mass majority of them don't even stay here. They stay in many cases for a month or two, they go on sit-down strikes in the plantations, and pretty soon the plantations decide they don't want to have anything to do with them. They just decided it was a really bad idea. But ironically, the plantations had caught themselves caught between a rock and a hard spot because they didn't have any way to send them back to Portugal because they didn't want to pay the money to send them back to Portugal. So the plantations, to cut their losses, just basically say, fine, if you don't want to work on the plantations, then we're not going to give you your house, we're not going to give you your land. I'm sure I want to shedding tears about that. And then you guys can just go, fine, go to Lahaina, go find a job, get the hell out of our face. We don't ever want to see you guys again. And the Portuguese go, up yours. And they jump ship and they go to the US mainland. This causes a huge stink on the US mainland because, as I mentioned at the beginning of class, Portuguese were not looked upon well in the 19th and 20th century on the US mainland. They were seen as one of these Southern European groups. So they were seen as not hard workers. They were seen as, there are all these negative stereotypes about being Portuguese. And along with that, of course, is unlike the group further east, they didn't speak Spanish. So they spoke a funny language that most folks in North America didn't speak. So the Portuguese that come over here in the early 20th century, the huge majority of them moved to the US mainland. It's caused a huge amount of stink. A lot of them end up in California in the fishing industry, especially around areas like Monterey. And there's a huge pushback from California, which is already, of course, incredibly racist by this time and hated Portuguese as almost as well as they did anyone else. And they get really upset because here's a territory shoving folks into California, as far as they saw, illegally. Because Hawaii was supposed to be recruiting people to stay in Hawaii. Folks in Hawaii were not supposed to be allowed to go from Hawaii as a territory to the mainland United States. And so the U.S. government gets involved with this and tells the plantations, you got to cut this crap out. And the plantations basically then say, well, how can we? And the government says, well, we don't care. So they shut down the immigration. The Portuguese government shuts down immigration from Portugal proper in 1911 because of the abuses of the plantations. The plantations managed to twice in a row, which has to be some sort of a record, to, in the same country, piss the same government off twice for the same excesses and the same screw-ups that they repetitively do time and again. These folks aren't dumb. You got to wonder what the plantations were thinking, but the end result is the Portuguese. The second group is almost invisible here. It's very hard to find folks from the second migration. Not many of them are here. Most of them end up in California, and God knows where they've dispersed to in the 20th century. But that group pretty much vanishes. This group is largely still here because they came over as families, so they did set down roots here in Hawaii. So in the early part of the 20th century, the Portuguese were probably the largest single ethnic Haole group in Hawaii, in the sense that they were from a European possession, though that quickly sort of shrinks. But what that means is they're hugely important here, because what happens is the Portuguese end up as the model for everyone else. The European, the Anglos that run the place, the Hawai'i here, initially bring in the Portuguese as middle. The Portuguese leave the plantations, but they keep the middle, if you want to think of it that way. So if you're part of the Hawai'i elite, you find yourself shopping in Portuguese stores. You find yourself shopping in stores or other types of businesses run by Portuguese immigrants who originally were supposed to be on the plantation. If you're the Chinese or other folks and you want to move in the urban states, which is where most of the Portuguese move to, they move to the towns. Then what happens is you end up working for the Portuguese, or you too end up buying stuff in a Portuguese store. So a lot of your initial mom and pop stores, especially on the other islands in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, are Portuguese owned, which makes sense because it's a great way to raise a family. Mom and dad can run the store, the kids can work in the store when they're not in school, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And that ends up being sort of the Portuguese experience. Now, what this also means is that if you're Japanese or you're some of these later groups, Okinawan, Korean, whatever, and you're arriving in Hawaii 10, 20, 30 years later, and once you hear about the Portuguese experience, the Portuguese, and to a lesser extent the Chinese, become the model that you're going to use for life off the plantation. If the Portuguese can raise a family and live in Hawaii and not be on the plantation and make a pretty decent living out of it, then I should be too. I should be able to do the same thing. The Portuguese also, because they were in this betwixt and between, they were Catholic, so they were Christian. They came from Europe, sort of technically. This means that the folks that run the place, the Hawai'i elites, and even your folks, coming over in the 20th century from the mainland United States, see them as being European. They don't see them as part of they don't check the box called Asian that most of the other populations here, and they're not Hawaiian. So in that context, they become the interface. The Portuguese are the first to get into the standard English schools. The Portuguese are the first to get into the private schools. The Portuguese are the big sponsors of places like here, St. Louis and Sacred Hearts and your other Catholic schools, which become major educational institutions in the late 19th century. That's because the Portuguese want to send their kids to a school that has their value system, not the Punahou value system. So the Portuguese then, and that's not surprising, the Chinese then follow the Portuguese. And that's why Sacred Hearts and St. Louis have a tradition of Chinese Portuguese. A lot of the regents, if you look at the regents of both those schools, and at Damien too, they're Chinese Portuguese, St. Anthony's on Mount. And that's because that's the groups that set those schools up. They're the ones that get into basically a new version of what middle class is. The Portuguese become the first middle class in Hawaii. And that becomes the door access because they're willing to interact and marry with the Chinese and the other groups. And that allows these groups to move into middle class standing, whereas in the mainland, they're usually segregated and remain in lower class standing. I remember that video that you guys saw on the Chinese, experience in the US mainland. Okay. So with that, I guess we're set. Stop that. Okay, that all sort of makes sense? I guess so, no one's saying anything. One of the things to remember, if you ever wanted to do a study, if you're in business, you could probably do a real interesting study of the management failure of the plantations. I have no idea, I've never bothered to look into it, but there must be a ton of literature just in the plantation owners writing to each other and things in newspapers and such about why they persistently made these incredibly bad decisions. And they did them with a history attached to it, since in many cases they're making decisions already knowing what the bad decision was going to lead to. Some really odd logic in the plantation business here in Hawaii, which in some ways you could actually argue segues into the tourism business here in Hawaii in the 20th century. So are there any questions or anything else?
I have a
Go ahead.
one. I'm just wondering, since like obviously the plantation's decisions were ill thought out, but were they still making money hand over foot during?
Yeah. Oh yeah, and that's probably at some point you're probably right. That's probably why they didn't give a rat's ass, because they were making a ton of money. And you're not giving away any good land to the Portuguese. So that means that's one more acre in sugar. You're not paying for board lumber, so that's cheaper. The Portuguese are going to cut the trees down. Yeah, I mean, on one hand, they would have made a gazillion dollars even with the Portuguese being happy. And if you think about it, if I'm the guy in charge of a plantation, I sort of want the guys that are directly under me, the supervisors, the happier they are, the more that they're going to make sure the guys that are working are going to do a better job of cutting cane. So it's one of those weird situations. They were so fascinated with maximizing their profit margin that they completely destroyed their company, at least in my view. And made life incredibly difficult for themselves because, if you just piss this guy off and you basically sold his family down the river to a certain extent, and he's living in a tent looking at this acre of land, and you say, okay, what do you think we need to do next week? How can you trust what he's going to tell you? Why does he have the interest in the plantation in his heart? You don't have any interest in him in your heart. So I don't know. It's just a really weird thing. I don't know if it's unique to Hawaii. I'm sure it's not. The history of American management in the late 19th century, this is the period of the robber barons. So I have a bad feeling that you're probably right. This is probably just the way business was done. But it's pretty terrifying when you think about it, because this is oftentimes the model that people now talk about going back to, which is pretty surreal.
So these, the landowners were primarily American, then I assume, right?
Well, no, they're the Kamaina, and that's the weird thing about this. These guys are part Hawaiian. They're born and raised in Hawaii. So it's important to remember by the 1880s, by 1878, by 1880, by the time the first stage of this goofy thing is going on. In fact, it's a good question because it goes all the way through. The plantations were almost never owned by folks from the mainland United States. They're almost always owned by folks who were born and raised here. And if you're going to use the definition of local as someone who's born and raised here, they're actually the first group of local. So it's oftentimes the stereotype of the owners is, oh, they're Americans, and therefore they're reaming the locals out. No. They're actually part Hawaiians in most cases. Yeah, they're reaming the other locals out, but they're local also. So you would assume they'd have a little better idea of what and why things were happening. But you know, their mentality was very New England. But they're actually from here. So like kids that were born here, but they go to school in Massachusetts and all of a sudden they come back when they're 20 years old. So on one hand, they have family here, but I'm not sure, you know, the evidence would suggest they really didn't understand nor particularly care about the world here in many ways. They just saw themselves in charge. But yeah, I mean, there's not really been a lot of good work done on the Kama'aina. Roar talks to them about, of course, it's a major part of her book in parts. But I've never actually seen you see biographies of them, but I've never actually seen a study of the sort of attitude patterns. And you know, in many ways, they define Hawaii right from the 1850s right into, I'd argue, since many of them end up being the hotel industry. And most of your resorts are on Kama'aina plantation land. You could argue in many ways they still control Hawaii in the 2020s. You know, Campbell Estate, Bishop Estate, the Damons, the Wilcoxes, Alexander and Baldwin. I mean, it's the same names. So yeah, go figure. It's Hawaii's an interesting place when you look at a lot of this stuff. It's hard to figure out the dynamics. Any other questions? We all good? Okay.